Have you ever used Firefox OS, Symbian, or maybe BlackBerry back in the day? If you have, congrats. You're officially part of the golden generation of the mobile era, because none of these operating systems exist anymore. They're literally extinct, because Apple and Android personally dug their graves. And, the stories behind their death are actually pretty fascinating and kind of sad. Today, we're going to look at 5 of the world's top mobile OSs that no longer work anymore. Let's start with probably the most known one, Mozilla Firefox OS. Back in 2012, Mozilla, the folks behind the Firefox browser, decided they wanted to make their own OS for mobile phones. And honestly, their idea wasn't terrible. Basically, they wanted to create a completely open, web-based mobile OS that could run on super cheap phones in developing markets. The whole thing was built on HTML5. What that means is developers could build apps and games using the stuff they used for making websites. They figured web developers outnumbered native app developers by like 10 to 1, which means they would instantly have this massive army of app creators ready to go. But here's the thing though. In reality, Firefox OS phones were painfully slow. Like, painful. I remember playing with one at a tech conference around 2013, and it felt like using a phone underwater. The touch was so slow, it made you question whether you'd actually tap the screen or not. The first devices hit the market in 2014, and when I say hit, they kinda limped in with sad little $80 to $100 devices that could barely run the OS. The apps were basically glorified websites, which meant they needed constant internet connectivity to work well. And the target markets, places like India, Brazil, and parts of Africa, often had spotty connectivity at best. So you'd have this phone that was already struggling performance-wise, and then half of the apps wouldn't even work properly because your connection dropped. Not exactly a recipe for success. And this was happening at the exact time Android was starting to get really good at the budget phone game. Google had figured out how to scale Android down to work on cheap hardware, and manufacturers like Xiaomi were pumping out decent Android phones at rock-bottom prices. Firefox OS never really had a chance. But Mozilla kept trying. They partnered with companies like ZTE, Alcatel, and even Panasonic, who made a Firefox OS TV for some reason. They released multiple versions of the OS, improving it each time, but the market just didn't care. By 2016, Mozilla looked at their market share, which was basically a rounding error, and pulled the plug. 4 years of development, millions of dollars spent, and nothing. The craziest part, some of Firefox OS actually survived in this weird zombie form called KaiOS, which runs on some feature phones today, so I guess part of it is still technically shambling around the mobile graveyard. Speaking of operating systems that got absolutely murdered by the competition, let's talk about Symbian. And unlike Firefox OS, Symbian actually used to be a massive deal. You want to know what true dominance looks like? At its peak around 2006, Symbian was running on about 70% of all smartphones globally. That's not a typo, 70%. For comparison, Android today has about 70% market share. That's how big Symbian was. Nokia was the main company behind Symbian, and those phones were... So if you were anybody in the business world in the 2000s, you probably had a Nokia smartphone with a tiny keyboard and that weird little joystick thing. But then 2007 happened, and by 2007, I mean the iPhone. Steve Jobs got on the stage, showed the world what a touchscreen phone could be, and Symbian instantly lurked. Oh! Nokia tried to adapt Symbian for touch, but oof, it was rough. The interface was clunky, complicated, and just felt old. Using a touchscreen-enabled Symbian phone after using an iPhone was like going back to dial-up after experiencing broadband. The really tragic part of the Symbian story came in 2011. When Nokia's new CEO, a former Microsoft exec by the way, basically declared Symbian dead and announced Nokia would switch to a Windows Phone. Even as we go through a transition towards our primary smartphone platform, Windows Phone, you will see that continued investment. We've now been very clear about that. that software updates to Symbian devices are expected until at least 2016. It was like watching someone shoot their own pet. Painful stuff. By 2013, Symbian was officially discontinued, from 70% market share to zero in just a few years. That's not just a fall from grace, that's falling off a cliff while on fire. Now, if you thought Symbian's death was brutal, wait until you hear about BlackBerry. Because BlackBerry didn't just die, it committed the corporate equivalent of slow-motion suicide. Remember when having a BlackBerry made you feel important? Those little QWERTY keyboards, the satisfying click of typing out an email, that blinking red notification light. BlackBerry wasn't just a phone, it was a status symbol. BlackBerry OS was built for one thing and one thing only: business communication.
Good, pick up the phone and start dialing.
Email, messaging, security. This was BlackBerry's bread and butter, and they were really, really good at it. Like, the entire US government and most Fortune 500 companies were using BlackBerry devices. Even Obama had one. He famously fought to keep his BlackBerry when he became president because he was so attached to it. What made BlackBerry special was their infrastructure. They had this ownership system called BlackBerry Enterprise Server that directed all messages through their secure network. It was secured, compressed, and incredibly effective with data usage, which was really important because back then, data plans were super expensive. Plus, BBM, the BlackBerry Messenger, was basically WhatsApp before WhatsApp existed, and it was way more secure. Whereas the original iPhone actually kinda sucked at email compared to BlackBerry. But what BlackBerry completely missed was that people wanted to do more with their phones than just send emails. They wanted to browse the full web, use apps, take decent photos, watch videos, all the things that early BlackBerry devices were terrible at. And the executives at BlackBerry, previously called Research in Motion, had the worst reaction possible to the iPhone. They literally thought it was a toy that would never catch on with serious business people. The co-CEO Mike Lazaridis famously said, "It's hard to type on a piece of glass." We have to be realistic about the history of touchscreen technology. We have to remember that this is not new, this has been done, this has been tried before. However, people figured out how to type on touchscreens pretty quickly. By the time BlackBerry realized they needed to adapt, it was way too late. They launched BlackBerry 10 in 2013, which was actually decent, but the app ecosystem was a ghost town. Developers just didn't care anymore. The final nail in the coffin? In 2015, BlackBerry released an Android phone called the Priv. It was basically them waving the white flag. After a few more years of zombie-like existence, BlackBerry OS was officially discontinued in 2022, though it had been effectively dead for years. The BlackBerry story is literally a business school case study in how to completely miss a market shift. They went from owning the smartphone world to nothing. All because they couldn't imagine a world where business people would want to use a phone without a physical keyboard. But you know who should have actually succeeded in the mobile world? Microsoft. They have the resources, the developer relationships, and honestly, a pretty cool OS. And yet, they still managed to completely blow it with Windows Phone. Here is something controversial. Windows Phone was actually really good. Like, the interface with those live tiles was genuinely innovative, and sometimes I miss it. There, I said it. Microsoft had been in the mobile game for years with Windows Mobile, which was this clunky, stylus-based OS for business types. But in 2010, they completely started over with Windows Phone 7, and it was a total reimagining of what a mobile OS could look like. Instead of just copying iOS like everybody else was doing, Microsoft created this totally fresh interface with tiles that updated in real time. It was clean, it was fast, and it was different in all the right ways. The Metro design language was so well received that Microsoft eventually used it for Windows 8, Xbox, and pretty much all their products. The problem wasn't the OS, it was everything else. Microsoft was catastrophically late to the party. By 2010, iOS and Android had already built up huge app ecosystems, and developers just weren't interested in building for a third platform with tiny market share. This created the classic chicken and egg problem. People wouldn't buy Windows phones because it didn't have the apps, and developers wouldn't make apps because not enough people had Windows phones. It was a death spiral from day one. Microsoft tried everything. They bought Nokia's phone business for $7.2 billion in 2013. They redesigned the OS multiple times. They even paid developers to port popular apps. But nothing worked. By 2017, Microsoft officially gave up. Windows Phone was dead, and $7.2 billion had essentially been set on fire. All we got was some cool commercials and the brief, beautiful dream of a three-way mobile OS competition. And finally, let's talk about an OS that technically isn't completely dead, but as a phone operating system, yeah, Samsung's Tizen was basically dead on arrival. Tizen is the operating system equivalent of that one friend who keeps trying to make their weird passion into a career. Samsung really wanted Tizen to be a thing. The backstory here is fascinating. Samsung became the biggest smartphone maker in the world by using Android OS, but they were also terrified of being too dependent on Google. So around 2012, they started developing Tizen as their escape plan. Tizen was actually built from the ashes of another failed mobile OS called Nigo, which deserves a different video of its own. So if you want a video on Nigo, just let me know in the comments. And by the way, if you're enjoying this video, make sure to subscribe. Okay, so back to the video. Samsung's strategy was confusing at best. They released a few Tizen phones in markets like India and Russia that never really committed to it in major markets. The phones themselves were decent hardware running software that felt like a weird Android knockoff with no apps. And that was the killer problem. No apps. Again, it's always the apps. Samsung tried to entice developers with contests and cash prizes, but nobody was biting. Why build for Tizen when you could reach way more users on Android or iOS? The final Tizen smartphone was released in 2017, and while Samsung never officially declared it dead, they pretty much abandoned it as a phone OS. The weird thing is, Tizen actually lives on in Samsung's TVs, watches, and other devices. So it's kind of a half success story, I guess. But as a competitor to Android and iOS, completely dead. And probably the least surprising failure on this list. Because, honestly, did anyone think Samsung was going to pull this off? And Tizen wasn't the only time that a major company tried to break the Android-iOS stranglehold with their own OS. You want to know about a genuinely tragic story? Let's talk about Palm Web OS. Probably the most innovative mobile operating system that absolutely nobody bought. Seriously, this one still hurts to talk about. Palm Web OS is like that indie band that music critics absolutely loved, but somehow never made it big. Launched in 2009 with the Palm Pre, WebOS was literally years ahead of its time. I'm not exaggerating when I say that features you use on your iPhone or Android today were straight up stolen from WebOS. The whole OS was built around this card-based multitasking system where you could flick between apps like they were playing cards. Sounds familiar? Yeah, that's because everyone copied it later. They have this gesture area below the screen where you could swipe back or up to go home again, something iOS and Android would eventually adopt. And the Palm Pre itself was pretty slick too. They have this slide-out keyboard that felt so satisfying to type on, wireless charging, and a design that was actually trying something different than just copying the iPhone. So why did it fail? Honestly, bad timing and worse luck. Palm was basically running on fumes financially when they launched WebOS. The hardware, while interesting, felt kinda cheap compared to iPhones, and Sprint as their launch partner in the US, not exactly a carrier you'd pick if you wanted to reach the most people. The real death knell came when HP bought Palm for $1.2 billion in 2010, promising to go all in on WebOS. They released exactly one phone and one tablet before the CEO at the time, Leo Apotheker, panicked and killed the entire division. It was one of the most expensive corporate faceplants in tech history. By 2011, WebOS was basically dead as a phone platform. In a weird twist, LG eventually bought the rights and now uses WebOS in their smart TVs. So this revolutionary mobile OS is now checking if you want to watch Netflix or Hulu. Talk about a fall from grace. The saddest part, if you look at smartphones today, WebOS's DNA is everywhere. It was just too early, too underfunded, and too unlucky to succeed. But not every failed mobile OS story ended in complete disaster. Some actually lived on as weird tech zombies, like Sailfish OS, a platform most people have never heard of, but that's somehow still alive today. It's the mobile OS equivalent of that guy who shows up to a party uninvited, but refuses to leave. Sailfish OS is basically what happened when a bunch of ex-Nokia engineers looked at the smoking ruins of MeeGo and said, "Screw it, we'll do it ourselves." After Nokia ditched MeeGo for Windows Phone, these engineers formed a company called Yola and created Sailfish. Launched in 2013, Sailfish was like the hipster alternative to mainstream mobile operating systems. It was heavily gesture-based, focused on privacy, and had this weird but kinda cool minimalist vibe. Using a Sailfish phone felt like being part of some secret tech club that was too cool for Apple or Google. What made Sailfish interesting was how it tried to solve the app problem that killed every other alternative OS. They built in Android app compatibility, so you could actually run many Android apps on Sailfish devices. This wasn't perfect, some apps would break and you didn't get Google services, but it was a clever approach to the ecosystem problem. The first Yola phone was fine. Not amazing, just fine. It had mid-range specs and a distinctive split-color design called the Other Half, where you could swap backs that would automatically change themes and add functionality. Neat concept, but not exactly something that would make iPhone users jump ship. Unlike most entries a la OS Graveyard Tour, Sailfish is technically still alive, but it's not exactly thriving. Yola pivoted from making hardware to licensing the OS, focusing on customers who really care about privacy and independence from US tech giants. They found some success in Russia, for obvious reasons, and with various European government agencies. The weird thing about Sailfish is that it's probably the most successful failed mobile OS. It's been around for a decade now, outliving much better funded competitors, but its market share is so tiny that most people have never even heard of it. It's like the mobile OS that exists in a parallel universe, one where there's actually room for more than two mobile platforms, even if it's just barely hanging on. Moving on to the final part. What killed all these operating systems? It wasn't necessarily that they were bad, some of them were actually pretty innovative. It comes down to three things. First, timing. If you weren't in the smartphone game by like 2010, you were probably too late. Second, apps. The ecosystem is everything, and if developers don't care about your platform, you're dead. And third, the network effect. Once everyone you know has an iPhone or Android, why would you choose something different that can't run the same apps? The mobile OS wars are basically over now. We live in a duopoly world of iOS and Android, and honestly, that's kinda sad. Competition drives innovation, and with only two players left standing, things have gotten a bit boring. But hey, at least we can look back at these failed operating systems and appreciate the weird and wonderful alternatives they tried to offer. And who knows, maybe someday a new challenger will rise up and actually succeed where these five failed. But I wouldn't bet on it. If you enjoyed this tech obituary, hit subscribe for more stories about failed tech products that time forgot.